The Seihan warrior slumped against the walls of the trench, clutching onto her rifle in fear as the sounds of combat wore away at her resolve. Her people were a hive species that held a strict caste system, though it was flawed in that members of each caste were indistinguishable, aside from their role, which resulted in soldiers with weak chitin, or more likely unprepared for the mental horrors of trench warfare. Sui 5826 was one such example. A female of the warrior caste who found herself shaking as she held her weapon close to her chest and tears forming in her eyes. The other Seihan that were scattered along the trench weren't much different. All exhibited signs of graying, a term that referenced the carapace turning colorless, often accompanied by nightmares, blackouts, and outright suicidal tendencies. Sui 5826 hadn't quite reached the graying yet, but the early signs were there, staring into nothingness and frequent nightmares that she had reported to her medical assessor, only to be told that she was exaggerating and sent back on patrol. She hated the trench. She sometimes hoped that they would make a charge across the fields, and she didn't even mind if it would get her killed, if only to be away from this place. Sui 5826. You are relieved and free to return to the resting pod. Ensure your weapon is clean before you begin your rest. The marshal spoke to her. He was a member of the commanding caste, and as such was less than popular with her fellow warriors. They had a tendency to be arrogant and cruel when addressing the lesser castes. Though despite her disdain for the man, he was still allowing her to get some sleep, and no sane life form would argue with that. As the insectoid woman lay down on her bunk, her freshly cleaned rifle at her side, she began to think of a rumor that circulated amongst the other warriors and making her question its veracity. Supposedly they were due reinforcements from one of the ally species, one that she had never heard of before called humans. I wonder what they would be like. Prepare for orbital drop. The mechanical voice instructed the human marine, who promptly complied by double-checking his harness and forming his index finger and thumb into a circle to signal his readiness. Disengaging clamps, brace. Falling through space into a planet's atmosphere was a common occurrence within the Marines, though many disapproved of utilizing the maneuver as it was such a high-risk tactic. The chances of being off course or burning up on entry were too high for most. What was less known to those outside the Corps was that an orbital drop was only used by the super heavy warsuits, or guerrilla walkers as their pilots referred to them. Garrick was one such pilot. He also happened to be the one plummeting toward the Seihan homeworld to provide support to their front line, and would be doing so alone. Computer, keep my vitals on HUD and get me a comms link to the Seihan commander at the drop zone. The human commanded, the interface within the warsuit complying without delay. Before too long, he was able to hear a confused Seihan commander caste spluttering something about unauthorized use of a secure channel, but he was promptly cut off. You have one friendly guerrilla inbound to your location. Just ensure your boys don't shoot at me, okay? Just what does the feed was cut as the Marine had cut through the atmosphere, armor plating glowing with heat as the warsuit fell. Garrick took this moment of calm to observe the scenery. A beautiful sunset on an alien homeworld. Wasn't something he saw very often, but it wasn't to last as he noted that the suit was being targeted by anti-air weapons. Oh, for the love of... Sui 5826 woke with a start and all but jumped to an upright position, her talons extended. This had been the fourth time she awoke in such a manner that week, though she quickly composed herself and checked a nearby timepiece, revealing she had slept for only 3 hours. With a sigh, the warrior pulled herself from the bunk and began dressing herself for patrol, putting on her boots and collecting her equipment. Yet as she left the resting pod, a bright light caught her eye. Looking up at the phenomenon, it appeared as though an object was falling from the sky, though just before she dismissed it as a chunk of debris, enemy autocannons began firing at the object. She watched in utter confusement as the chunk of metal began almost dancing around the shots, far too precise movements to be random. A machine. It was at this point she noticed that whatever the mechanical entity was, it was heading straight for the trench line she was currently in. Looking around, however, the commander was nowhere to be seen, and as such, she had no choice but to maintain her position, face punishment for abandoning her post. Get me an ETA on touchdown and deploy flares immediately. Garrick commanded to the suit's interface, resulting in a dazzling display of red light around the warsuit as he continued tapping the directional thrusters to avoid more and more ordnance. Estimated touchdown will be in 60 seconds, 59 seconds, 58. He quickly interrupted the mechanical voice. Just put a counter on the HUD smartass. The information was added to the increasingly cluttered display, his vitals showing a significantly increased heart rate, but nothing he was concerned about. That was until yet another targeting lock flashed on the screen. Deploy the secondary flares. There was a mighty crash as the machine landed just outside the Seahan Trench. Sui dared to peek her head out to watch as it began slowly marching toward the enemy line. A hail of gunfire answered the mechanical biped's approach. Munitions of 100 different kinds were hurled at the giant, with not a single shot hindering its progress. Sui was enamored by the durability of such a device, its armor unyielding to what was an absurd amount of weapons fire, but that was when shouting from her own trench pulled her from the scene. Weapons ready! Ladders set! The marshal began shouting. Those orders were everything she feared. They were to charge the enemy trench line. As her fellow warriors took their places at the ladders, rifles loaded and in hand, her thoughts were shattered as an ungodly sound echoed and drowned out all others. The sound was an unending buzzing. She could not describe it well, but that was of no matter to the commander as he blew the whistle around his neck. With screams of both terror and bravery, the warriors began flooding out of the trench. Yet few to none fell as was expected. Once Sui had climbed out onto the field, their lack of fire on her fellow warriors was explained, as was the sound she had heard. The machine had reached the enemy trench and began firing a strange rotary gun into the enemy forces. The buzzing was the sound of hundreds of shots being fired within seconds. Yet this was not the machine's only weapons, as missile launchers fired from its back and struck into machine gun positions, the screams from its targets cut off by that horrific buzzing sound. Torcat forces engaged, firing auxiliary rockets. The artificial voice alerted, though Garrick was somewhat preoccupied with maniacal laughter at getting to fire the minigun. Technically, it was not actually a minigun, as this was the full-sized version of the weapon, the minigun being the handheld or light vehicle variant. But he didn't care. Everyone knew what he meant when he said minigun. Eat lead, space Nazis! Garrick began shouting at no one in particular. The computer was quick to correct the inaccuracies in his statement, however. Lead ammunition has not been utilized for centuries. The Torcat may have ideals aligned to the National Socialist Party of the early 20th century. They are not in fact space Nazis. Garrick just ignored the computer as he continued gunning down the aliens. He did find it somewhat entertaining that the computer made the distinction despite the Torcat being on a war crime speed run, and as far as the Marine was concerned, that made them fair game to insult at the very least. Human war machine, disengage, and we will send the warrior cast to clear the trench. The Seahan commander had reopened communications with the warsuit, but didn't seem to realize he was addressing a person. Negative, Buggy. I'm on a kill streak and you aren't stealing my picks. Besides, you guys would just get hurt, so just hold back for now until the enemy mortars are dealt with, he replied, earning a scoff from the commander as he began ranting about how he was the one in charge. Though before he actually heard any of the rant, warnings began flashing up on the warsuit HUD. Artillery! Get your soldiers to cover now. Sui had just reached the war machine as the telltale sounds of mortar shells could be heard falling toward their position, causing her to look for somewhere, anywhere she could hide. In her panic, she froze up as she saw a single shell heading straight toward her. She would be the latest in an uncountable list of warrior caste killed by the invaders. As she closed her eyes, the warrior allowed her tears to flow freely and unabated as she waited for the shells to hit. Get down! A strange and mechanical voice brought the warrior from her delirium. There was the sound of an explosion just above her, but no shrapnel to speak of hit her. Opening her eyes, the war machine was stood over her, its lights almost blinding as it shielded her from the mortar fire. Once she had recovered from her stupor, the warrior began moving into the trench with the machine continuing to cover her until finally the barrage stopped. Right, Since your commander is a jackass and wants you guys in harm's way, I'm going to go clear out that artillery emplacement. Do not follow me. Sui had far too many questions to ask, but evidently wouldn't get any answers as the machine began slowly lumbering in the direction the mortars had come from. After his departure, she finally found her voice. What's a jackass?